with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. So President Trump posted on social media, on Truth Social, and then had the presser with RFK and Dr. J and Dr. Marty in tow. I'll be citing one of the most consequential executive orders in our country's history. Prescription drug and pharmaceutical prices will be reduced almost immediately by 30 to 80%. They will rise throughout the world in order to equalize and, for the first time in many years, bring fairness to America, all caps. I will be instituting a most favored nation policy whereby the United States will pay the same price as the nation that pays the lowest price anywhere in the world. Our country will finally be treated fairly, and our citizens' health care costs will be reduced by numbers never even thought of before. We're going to save trillions of dollars as well on top of it. Everything's coming up roses. Price controls.
Yes.
And the way he illustrated the unfairness, as he would describe it, to Americans when it comes to pharma drugs is with a little story about his fat friend.
Yes, his fat friend taking the fat drug.
A story, a friend of mine who's a businessman, very, very, very top guy. Most of you would have heard of him.
Who is it?
Highly neurotic, brilliant businessman, seriously overweight, and he takes the fat shot drug. And he called me up, and he said, President, he calls me, he used to call me Donald, now he calls me President, so that's nice respect. But he's a rough guy, smart guy, very successful, very rich. I wouldn't even know how we would know this, but because he's got comments. President, could I ask you a question? What? I'm in London, and I just paid for this damn fat drug I take. I said, it's not working. He said, I just paid $88. And in New York, I pay $1,300. What the hell is going on? He said, so I checked. And it's the same box, made in the same plant, by the same company. It's the identical pill that I buy in New York. And here I'm paying $88 in London. In New York, I'm paying $1,300. Now, this is a great businessman, but he's not familiar with this crazy situation.
Well, it's a funny story.
I just want to know who it is.
Maybe you can tell your fat friend, try diet and exercise instead of paying $1,000 for Ozempic. I don't know.
Yeah. I know.
But as Kim Strassel writes in the Wall Street Journal, in a pretty compelling piece, I must say, price controls are price controls, no matter how proponents try to spin them. Tackling the problem of that is, I mean, it's a fair thing to point out, the disparity in prices paid by Americans and people of other countries. But as she writes, tackling the problem by taking it out on the innovators, by importing other countries' backward policies, will only harm the world's greatest producers of cures and replicate those countries' failing systems. Oh, by the way, as she mentioned, you might want to take a review of Europe. Europe's price controls on pharma drugs have reduced its one thriving pharma industry to dust, while Europeans and Australians and Canadians have access to far fewer drugs than are available to Americans, including breakthrough cancer treatments. Now, those nations also show how a lack of innovation leads to even higher healthcare costs in the longer run, because you don't have access to those same drugs in part. Then what do you do to deal with this unfairness in a productive way? Well, she's got some ideas. Doubling down on competition, including with Medicare Advantage, inject more price transparency, fix the regulatory system. In other words, one of the biggest problems in the healthcare system in America, as we've talked about quite a bit, is we had a backdoor government takeover of healthcare with Obamacare. And we had a government as the largest purchaser of health care well before Obamacare because of entitlement programs. And a government as the arbiter of scarce resources is the least efficient arbiter available. And so you have shortages and surpluses. The other problem with the healthcare system is the disconnect, right? Because government is the middleman. So the consumer has no idea what the price is for a particular good or service. There's no incentives present to control costs. And so you get into, you're just extending price controls that already beset the system. So how does that make sense? Well, I would argue it does not. And I think our next guest is going to argue the same, but more persuasively and with more detail than me. Professor Richard Epstein is the James Parker Hall Distinguished Service Professor, Emeritus of Law, and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh.
I think your prediction is correct. I am very much opposed to the president's initiative on this.
Well, I mean, explain your opposition, and then
Okay.
how we should think about addressing this issue of the disparate prices that the president brought up.
Yeah, well, first of all, they're also disparate costs. So if you want to buy one of these drugs in one of these small remote countries, they don't have any particular difficulty in getting it. They don't have an FDA approval process. They piggyback on us. And so you could supply them at $10, where to supply the same drug in America is going to cost you $100. So the first thing that the president ignores is the price differentials. The second thing he ignores is that if you make it to the most favored nation clause, and what you do is you sell $10,000 worth of goods in small African country at $100 a unit, it means that on that drug, when you sell it in America, where you sell it for, say, 10 times as much, you're going to reduce the amount of money that the United States can receive by $10 billion or something like that. So what's going to happen is the first move is not going to be to lower American prices. It's simply to remove all of these drugs from foreign markets so as to keep the prices high in the United States, which will result in two things. One is many more deaths in those places because they do not have the money to buy it. And secondly, it turns out there's one additional revenue stream, small though it may be, but substantial in many countries, which is no longer available to American producers, the consequence of which is there'll be a smaller incentive to start to innovate, and you won't get these drugs. Second thing the president doesn't know is that when you get these drugs turns out to be a very important problem. So you have high prices in America, you get immediate availability. You have low prices overseas in part because those countries, what they do is they do monopsony pricing. That is, they have only one buyer and they therefore drive the price down. So what's going to happen is instead of getting a drug right now, you're going to have to wait 6 months or a year in order to do it. And you're going to die because you don't get these drugs appropriately. And so he completely ignores the part-timing situation. And the other thing he ignores is that there is no simple competitive solution for dealing with drugs because of what is known as the marginal cost controversy. And I'll explain it to you. It's kind of technical, but it drives everything. And so the first incentive you say is, how much does it cost to make a pill, right? And the answer is really quite dramatic. If you look at the American kind of cost system, the first pill you make of any new drug is going to cost you roughly $2.5 billion. And the last pill that you're going to make is going to cost you 25 cents. And so somebody says, well, let's just pay the marginal cost for that 25-cent pill. Well, it's really great, except you realize that if you only pay 25 cents for the last pill, you'll never get the first pill. So pricing of drugs is always a nightmare because what you have to do is to figure out how you pay for that lump cost of building the drug. In the famous physical example, it's very cheap to go over a bridge and very expensive to build the bridge. What do? Well, if you want to have government subsidies, Mr. Trump can certainly do this. And he could try to negotiate with other countries to get them to pay $2 billion to each country for all the drugs that it wants to develop. But then you really want to talk about government czars. The United States government has no idea whatsoever which drugs to develop or why. What it can do is it could regulate them after they're developed for various kinds of safety issues. So he's going to have to put huge amounts of money out. And some people say, well, we'll give a prize for somebody for making a new drug. But are you going to give him a $100 million prize when a drug like Lipitor gets, $8 billion a year? The prices have to be comparable, or otherwise the production will start to shut down. So what do? You have to price discriminate, which means that you look at the different demand curves at different places, depending in part on wealth and depending in part on the quality and the speed of the services you provide. And you charge higher prices in America. They get the drugs first, and the drugs get developed. And then the British come along, and they play monopsonist against us, and we can't get as much out of them. So what Trump has to do if he wants to equalize the prices is to tell every foreign country in the world which uses centralized buying and has no internal development, what you have to do is to break yourself up into a competitive industry. Do you think you could tell a foreign sovereign how they're supposed to buy these drugs? I don't think he can do that. And I think that the resentment will be crazy. So this equilibrium is going to exist. But the advantage of it for the United States is we get more drugs, we get them sooner, and in fact, we get them with greater assurance of safety and so forth. Now, people have suggested, well, we could avoid all of this stuff, and what we could do is buy our drugs in Canada and then transship them into the United States, or buy them in London like his fat friend and ship them into the United States. That turns out to be very difficult to do. Many years ago, Pfizer wrote one of the most chilling memos I've ever read about drugs. And it didn't have to do with prices. It had to do with contamination, purity, and effectiveness. And so what happens is when we started to buy drugs from Canada and transship them, the Canadian government announced they're not going to bear the cost of inspecting these drugs for purity and everything else because they're not being sold here. Now, it turns out if you look at this market, the contamination and the fraudulent production, for example, by diluting a drug, is a rampant industry. Many years ago, a friend of mine named Jeff Lydon told me how often they at Abbott had to change their codes in order to make sure that the drugs weren't purloined in one fashion or another. And it was every couple of weeks because that's how serious it is. So the Canadians are not going to check our drugs out, and you're going to have real quality assurances, diluted drugs, contaminated drugs, and so forth, unless we start to inspect it.
But on the cost side, what would you say? Say, these
change the FDA.
I'm sorry.
Change the FDA procedures, which you can do.
Make it easier to bring a drug to market, less expensive.
Yeah. So essentially, what you try to do is to get rid of the major problems before you market the drug, but then constantly monitor them afterwards. And so one of the things you start to do is to look at the delay in American drugs and the additional cost that it puts on. Remember, interest is part of the cost of the drug. And if it takes you 11 years to get an approval, the interest rates that you have to spend in year one really accumulate. So huge portion of the cost is essentially paying interest for delay. And there's no way to avoid that unless you can improve that. The late Bud Relman, who used to run the New England Journal of Medicine, knew nothing about drug pricing. And when he sort of suggested, just ignore interest costs because they're not real cost of production. Well, you can ignore them, at which point the companies go absolutely bankrupt. So you can't do it. You have to change it in that way. And, they can do it. Now, you've got to be careful about this. You need ex post monitoring. You have to worry about drug company liability. And in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry is highly vulnerable to suits. So when you start talking about the prices here, where everybody can sue the government, it turns out for huge sums of money, if something goes wrong, it's more expensive. You go over to England, now you try to bring a drug suit against the English government. The answer is you don't get anything whatsoever out of it. And so you're buying a very different product in the United States with all the extra stuff that are put in. And by the time it goes through it all, it's very clear that the president has no idea what's going on. MFN is simply the worst possible policy that you could announce. And if he thinks he could reduce the cost, he's saying, okay, the development budgets of these pharmaceutical companies is, say, 30%, and the small companies even smaller. And now what's going to happen is they're going to have to be able to raise 90% of their capital overseas. Multiple parties, they're not going to be able to do it. So what he will do is destroy the system. Trump has the following serious weaknesses. He's a kind of a populist, and he says, well, here's a guy who really doesn't like the drug, and he tells an anecdote. Now, what you have to do is say, all right, Mr. Trump, you tell me how you're going to deal with the marginal cost controversy, and how much you're going to backload costs from the first unit to others, and how are you going to do it? Now, these companies are absolute pros at all of that stuff. And it gets very complicated because if you look at any of the standard literature on this subject, you'll discover that nobody knows how you price pharmaceutical drugs in an obvious way because they're rebates, they're different channels of distribution. So if you sell to a healthcare company, what it's going to do is play your drug off against somebody else's drug and get much lower prices. But if you're a retail outlet and you have to cover every kind of drug and so forth, you don't have that advantage. So what's going to go is in order to get the price system, there's going to be a huge amount of this price discrimination. So what the president didn't mention is that if, in fact, you buy it through one kind of system, you get a much lower price than if you buy it through another kind of system. And then you say, well, why don't you just get rid of the second kind of system? Well, there are large numbers of Americans who don't buy their drugs through drug plans. And you really think that what Trump wants to do is to say the entire retail pharmacy industry should go on? The other thing is the situation with generics is very difficult. One of the drugs that he mentioned was insulin, and there's no patent monopoly on that, no FDA approval stuff on that. And so you have to look at the price of insulin in the United States and look at it overseas and try to figure out what's going on with respect to that. And if you actually look at the entry terms with respect to generic drugs, it turns out that sometimes you have to go through a large amount of testing in order to get these things through. And so the system is so complicated. And it's just intellectually irresponsible to get a friend and to start to talk about an anecdote when you're talking about $400 or $500 billion worth of industry, and he's managed to explain $3.88. And the irony is, of course, is rich people are the only people who can afford to pay enough for these drugs in order to keep them on the market. So if you lower his price to the price of everybody else, poor people won't get any drugs. And this is a disaster in the making. And so the only question to ask now is, well, why is it that the stock market hasn't crashed on these drugs? Well, two things. First, there was China. But the other thing is there's no enforcement mechanism built into this statute. And so the industry says, we'll try to do it. And calling them, by the way, I might say, the most powerful industry in the world, the Inflation Reduction Act was the most colossal defeat that the industry suffered. It's a disastrous piece of legislation, confiscatory in its extreme. It was put into place by Biden, and it's now being enforced by Trump, and he doesn't know anything about it. But the sad thing about this, on antitrust matters and regulatory matters, at this point in the United States, there's no difference between the dumb Joseph Biden and the dumb Donald Trump. They have the same policy. Just look at the Google case. It was two administrations that put it out, and they basically may destroy another great company through the antitrust law. So the president on this issue is an ignorant man. He's overconfident, and what he's doing, in effect, he's playing with fire, and he doesn't even know that the matches can burn his hands.
Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
Oh, good. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. It's a really important problem.
All right. Thank you. And we'll have you back on soon. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The stories you need to know to start your day. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Honey, we're not moving, but we gotta do something about this kitchen.
Funny you mention it. I just stopped by Forever Remodeling's new showroom in Niles. I saw over a dozen kitchen and bathroom layouts they designed. They even offered to stop by the house and give us a free in-home design consultation.
What'd you tell them?
That we're free